Thanks for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, and check out my Instagram for cool science and not science stuff. This is going to be our first video where we talk about the Gait cycle, and we're going to talk about the first 3 phases in this video. That's going to be initial contact all the way through midstance. So let's begin with initial contact. And again, for reference, we're considering the right lower extremity, not the left. So first we have initial contact, or IC. Initial contact is less a phase of gait and more a snapshot or instant in time. And so down here in this picture, we have at the right lower extremity, we have initial contact. So what is initial contact? It's when the heel of the foot makes contact with the floor. And if the right heel here is contacting the ground, we obviously have an impact. And so part of the job here in initial contact is for impact deceleration. We obviously don't want to go crashing through the floor. We want to decelerate that impact. We also initiate something called the heel rocker. Now the heel rocker is something we're going to see in a video down here when we look at loading response, because this is really where the heel rocker is carried out, but we initiate it here. The basic idea of heel rocker, if you look at this picture right here, so this point right here is initial contact. We have the heel in contact with the ground. But as we go through the next phase of loading response, we're going to go from just heel on the ground to the entire plantar surface of the foot on the ground. And that process of going from just heel to the entire plantar surface of the foot, that is the heel rocker. And so we initiate that here. We're going to continue that and go through it in the loading response, the next phase. So when we look at these tables, we have a torque and we have muscles. The way I'm defining this is the torque here is the induced torque. An induced torque is a torque due to gravity. So what would happen if there were no muscles acting? What would gravity do at a particular joint? So to imagine this, if you just hold your arm up at 90 degrees, okay, what is gravity wanting to do? Well, gravity is wanting to bring your arm down toward your side. Okay, that's the induced torque. Then muscles here, this is the reactionary torque. Reactionary torque is what you have to do to counteract gravity. Okay, so if I bring my arm into 90 degrees of abduction, okay, gravity is wanting to make my arm adduct, to bring back to my side, right? And so to counteract that adduction-induced torque at the shoulder, I would have to apply an abduction torque through muscles, and that's through the deltoid. Okay, so that's kind of the way to think about these. Okay, so at initial contact at the hip, the induced gravitational torque is a rapid flexion torque. Okay, so at the hip joint, gravity, when we have initial contact, is going to tend to want to make our hips buckle down and fall towards the ground. So to counteract that, we have to have this reactionary torque that's given by the hip extensors. And so the hip extensors counteract that flexion torque at the hip. And by hip extensors, we're mainly talking about gluteus maximus. Might be some hamstrings, but mainly gluteus maximus here. Also note that in initial contact, the hip is in 20 degrees of flexion. Now let's go to the knee joint. In initial contact, there's a brief extension torque. So when we strike here, the tendency is actually for gravity to induce a slight extension. But if we have too much extension at initial contact, that would cause hyperextension. And so to counteract that extension torque at the knee, the hamstrings, which are knee flexors, are going to counter that torque to prevent hyperextension. And you'll also notice at the knee joint that we're not in complete extension. Okay? The knee is not completely straight. There's a little bit of flexion there. And on average, at initial contact, it's about 5 degrees of knee flexion. Now for the ankle joint, there's an induced gravitational plantar flexion torque. So when we look at the ankle, the tendency for gravity is to put this in more plantar flexion. If you think about it, with the heel contacted here, gravity's pushing the rest of the foot down towards the floor. And if you imagine this position relative to the foot completely flat on the floor would be more plantar flexion than we see here. So there is an induced plantar flexion torque at initial contact. To counteract this, we have isometric contraction of the pretibial muscles. What are pretibial muscles? Pretibial muscles are muscles that tend to dorsiflex the ankle joint. So we're thinking mainly tibialis anterior, and even extensor digitorum longus and extensor hallucis longus. Mainly we're thinking tibialis anterior, but we do include the others in that. And so those pretibial muscles isometrically contract to counter that induced plantar flexion torque at the ankle. Now for this phase, we're not really considering anything at the subtalar joint, and we're not considering anything at the MTP joints, the metatarsophalangeal joints. But we do need to consider the pelvis, and the pelvis is in 5 degrees of forward, or we call anterior rotation. What does that mean? So here's a picture taken from the top looking down at a person moving on the screen from left to right. And the rule, generally speaking, is whichever leg is leading, so for example here the right leg is out in front, that half of the pelvis is rotated anteriorly. Okay? So if we look at right initial contact, which is what we see right here, then the right half of the pelvis, or right hemipelvis, is going to be anteriorly rotated in the transverse plane, or horizontal plane. And so at initial contact, the right leg, which is our leading leg, is in front, so that half of the pelvis, or hemipelvis, is going to be in 5 degrees of anterior or forward rotation. So that is initial contact. Let's now go to loading response. And so I've got this continuous video playing here. And at the foot, what you really see there is the progression and completion of the heel rocker. Remember, we defined the heel rocker as going from only heel contact, which is basically initial contact, to the entire plantar surface of the foot in contact with the floor. Okay? That is the heel rocker. So we started it in initial contact, and now we're going to go through it and finish it in loading response. Okay? Now, the main function of loading response is weight acceptance. So as you go from initial contact through loading response, a huge percentage of your body weight has to be accepted by the lower extremity, and including the foot and all the bones in the foot. So we're going to see things that reflect the acceptance of body weight onto this foot as we load the entire plantar surface of the foot. Now, these other 3 things here we're going to see on the next slide in the table, but understand we're going to have restrained ankle plantar flexion, okay, restrained knee flexion, and sustained hip flexion. Let's find out what that means. So here's loading response. What's going on at the hips? So at the hips, there's really 2 induced gravitational torques. One's adduction at the hips. We're not going to concern ourselves with that one as much, but we still have this induced flexion torque at the hip. Now, what did we say about induced gravitational torques? Well, they're counteracted by reactionary torques, which are through muscles, right? So an induced flexion torque at the hip, which would normally cause our hips to kind of buckle down towards the ground in hip flexion, that's going to be counteracted by the hip extensor, so gluteus maximus, right? And then the adduction torque is going to be countered by its antagonist, the abductors. And mainly that's going to be gluteus medius and gluteus minimus, which are going to contract eccentrically. And so that sustained hip flexion, notice, okay, we still have this 20 degrees of hip flexion. That has not changed. Then at the knee joint, we have this induced gravitational flexion torque. Okay, if you stand up and you just all of a sudden go into total knee flexion, what happens? Your butt drops to the ground, right? So if you have too much flexion at the knee, you're going to fall to the ground, right? Your knees buckle. And so to prevent that buckling and to counteract that flexion torque at the knee, the quadriceps are going to contract eccentrically. Now, they're contracting eccentrically. So what does that mean? They're controlling the knee flexion. Okay, so we're still going to have knee flexion, but we're not going to have a huge amount of it because the quadriceps are controlling that movement. Okay, remember, in eccentric contraction, that muscle's still lengthening, okay, but it's controlling the movement. So we go from 5 degrees of knee flexion to 15 degrees of knee flexion through loading response. So we actually get a little bit extra knee flexion. Then at the ankle joint, we have this induced plantar flexion gravitational torque. And the pretibial muscles are eccentrically contracting to control that movement. So we're still getting plantar flexion torque, but it's being controlled by the pretibials. And anytime you see this eccentric, that's what you need to think, controlled plantar flexion or whatever the movement is. And so we go from a neutral ankle joint in initial contact to about 5 degrees of plantar flexion. And it's a little bit difficult to tell in this video, but as we go through the heel rocker in loading response, we're actually getting slightly more plantar flexion at the ankle joint. You can actually tell that a little bit easier in this picture up here. Notice at loading response, we basically have a neutral ankle. But then, in this picture, you can clearly see we have more plantar flexion. Okay? And that's because we have a plantar flexion torque at the ankle, but we don't get excessive plantar flexion because the pretibials control that movement eccentrically. Now for the subtalar joint. This is a fairly complicated joint, and we're not going to look at it in much detail in this video, but we want to understand a couple things about pronation versus supination. So subtalar pronation. When you have this movement of the subtalar joint, the individual tarsal bones within the foot kind of separate from each other, and they become more mobile. And this makes them better at absorbing force, or shock absorption. Now, with loading response, it makes sense to have better shock absorption, right, in the foot, because you're accepting almost your entire body weight onto one foot. So those bones in the foot better be good at absorbing shock. And so the way they do that is by slightly separating from one another and becoming a little bit more mobile. And when that happens, you get better shock absorption. And that's what we see with pronation. We won't see it in this video, but for supination at the subtalar joint, it's the opposite. Those tarsal bones actually come closer together, and they lock together and become more rigid. And that's worse at absorbing force, and what it's better for is actually force production. So providing a stable lever to produce force off of. And that'll make more sense when we get to the pre-swing phase. And generally, pronation is associated with subtalar eversion also. So at the subtalar joint, it's neutral in initial contact, 5 degrees of eversion in the loading response. Always associate subtalar eversion with subtalar pronation. Don't worry about the little bitty details right now. We're also not going to worry about the MTP joints in loading response, but remember that the right leg is still leading and in front, so we're going to have 5 degrees of anterior or forward rotation of the pelvis in the horizontal plane. That takes us to the third phase of gait, which is the midstance, or MST. Now, midstance is characterized by this ankle rocker. To understand that, look at this picture right here. Notice the tibia on the leading leg is posterior to the heel, or the ankle. As you go throughout midstance to the end of midstance, notice the tibia actually progresses anteriorly to the point where it's actually now anterior to the calcaneus or the tibia. So essentially the tibia rocks over the ankle joint. Okay, that is the ankle rocker. We also see 3 things right here that are associated with midstance, and that's restrained ankle dorsiflexion, or we could say controlled ankle dorsiflexion, restrained knee extension, and frontal plane hip stabilization. We'll get to that in a minute. That's very important. Now let's take a look and see what happens at the specific joints during midstance. The hip joint's really important and has a really important implication, so we're going to come back to that last. Let's actually look at the knee joint first. There is an induced gravitational extension torque at the knee. Now, as we know, usually when we have an extension torque at a joint, that's going to imply we need a muscle that performs flexion at that joint to counter that movement, okay, or control that movement in some way, right? So if we have an induced extension torque at the knee, that means we need a knee flexor, okay? Now, triceps suri, what is that? Triceps suri is really the gastrocnemius, both heads of it, and the soleus muscle. And we normally think of those muscles as plantar flexors, meaning they function at the ankle. But remember that, in particular, the gastrocnemius is a 2-joint muscle. So it does have function at the ankle, obviously, but it also functions at the knee. The gastrocnemius, not the soleus, is a knee flexor. Okay? So actually, this extension torque at the knee is countered by the triceps suri, and particularly the gastrocnemius. And so we basically have controlled knee extension in mid-stance. And so we go from 15 degrees of knee flexion to only 5 degrees of knee flexion due to that extension torque. Okay, so the triceps suri, they control that extension so that it's not excessive. So we still get some, but not a lot. Now let's look at the ankle joint. So at the ankle joint, we now have an induced dorsiflexion torque. Let's understand why that is. So if we look here, initially, that tibia is posterior to the heel. But that tibia is moving anteriorly. It's progressing over the ankle. It's that ankle rocker to the point at the end of mid-stance. Now the tibia is actually anterior to the ankle joint. What would gravity tend to do to the tibia right here? Well, if you just think about it, it would cause the tibia to fall forward, right? We don't want it just falling forward, so we need to control this dorsiflexion. How do we control that dorsiflexion? With plantar flexors, the triceps suri. So they're going to be contracting eccentrically here to control the dorsiflexion. And so at the beginning of mid-stance, we started in 5 degrees of plantar flexion, and now we're going to be in 5 degrees of dorsiflexion. That should make sense because of the ankle rocker. We're progressing that tibia from being posterior to the ankle and progressing it anteriorly like you see here at the end of mid-stance. Okay? So we just saw that restrained knee flexion due to the gastrocnemius, restrained ankle dorsiflexion due to the gastrocnemius and the soleus. And now we have to talk about the subtalar joint. So at the subtalar joint, we still have pronation, but it's decreasing. Okay, so it's less pronation than we saw in loading response. That also means less eversion than we saw in loading response. Now, in the middle of mid-stance, we're going to have our leading leg, which in this case is our right lower extremity, directly under the pelvis. So if it's under the pelvis, then that pelvis is neither going to be anteriorly nor posteriorly rotated in the frontal plane. So in mid-stance, at least the middle of mid-stance, the pelvis is actually neutral. So we go from that 5 degrees of anterior rotation back to neutral. And you can imagine as we go to the next phase in the next video, when the thigh basically now comes behind the body, we're going to go into posterior or backward rotation of the pelvis. And again, we have that ankle rocker. Now, to talk about the hip joint, we need to review one important thing here. And that's when we're in mid-stance on the right leg, notice that the left leg is off the ground. The left leg is actually in swing. The left leg is in swing. That means that the right leg is in single leg support. Our entire body weight is supported by the right leg. So remember that. Now at the hip joint, the induced torques are as follows. We have an extension gravitational torque, that one's not as important, and then an adduction gravitational induced torque. What does adduction do at the hip? Well, if your hip adducts, then it basically does what we're doing here in the video. Okay? It basically comes toward the midline of the body or further past the midline of the body. That's adduction. Okay? If you had no muscles counteracting that, this is what would happen. You'd have this extreme adduction, and that's not good, obviously. Throws you off balance. And so to counteract the adduction torque, you have to have the hip abductors contract. So right here what you see is I'm in a very adducted state. This is not good. And so what the abductors basically do is they keep me in this position right here. Okay? Notice going from this original position where I'm in total hip adduction to this position, I actually abducted the hips. And this is mainly the job of gluteus medius and gluteus minimus. Okay? This is very important. Okay? If you have dysfunctional gluteus medius / minimus, then you're going to end up with extreme adduction in mid-stance. Okay? That can be a Trendelenburg sign, which we'll talk about in another video. But this is very bad. And so, in order to prevent that adduction torque, we have to have the gluteus medius and minimus contract to provide what we call frontal plane stability. Okay? Remember, adduction and abduction occur in the frontal plane. So to prevent that excessive adduction and to maintain this position right here, contract the gluteus medius and minimus for frontal plane stability. So hopefully that gave you some good information on the first 3 phases of gait. It's fairly complicated, but we're going to be covering the other phases in 2 other videos here, so make sure to look for those. It'll be in the playlist as well. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. Thank you.